On January 17, 2014, a 5-year-old boy named Garnet Spears was taken to a hospital in New York. His mother, Lacey Spears, said he had been having seizures, and at first, this looked like another frightening chapter in a life already filled with medical problems. Because according to Lacey, Garnet had always been sick. She had posted about it online. She had asked friends to pray. She had built an entire public identity around being the mother of a fragile child. To the people following her story, Lacey looked exhausted, devoted, and heartbroken. But inside the hospital, the case began to change. Doctors put Garnet under observation. They set up a video EEG to capture what they believed might be seizures. The camera was supposed to help explain what was happening to him. Instead, it recorded something that would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in a murder trial. The footage showed Lacey and Garnet going toward the hospital room bathroom. Lacey was carrying a white cup, and according to the court record, she appeared to be carrying an attachment connected to Garnet's feeding tube. Soon after, Garnet became violently ill. Then the pattern appeared again. Bathroom, cup, tube attachment, symptoms. And then came the lab result that turned a medical mystery into a criminal investigation. Garnet's sodium level was dangerously high, so high that his brain began to swell, so high that doctors could not save him. And suddenly the question was no longer, what is wrong with Garnet? The question was, who is doing this to him?
This is the story of Lacey Spears and the murder of her son, Garnet Paul Thompson Spears. It is a case about a child whose life was filtered through hospital rooms, social media posts, medical claims, and a mother's carefully controlled story. It is also a case about one of the hardest crimes to detect, medical child abuse, where the danger can hide behind concern, behind tears, behind a parent who seems to be doing everything right. And to understand what happened, we have to investigate this case piece by piece, not by starting with the verdict, not by assuming everyone should have known, but by following the clues in the order they appeared. The public story, medical history, the feeding tube, the hospital footage, the blood test, the phone searches, the salt, and the final question that still lingers over the case. How did a mother convince so many people that she was fighting for her son, while prosecutors said she was the source of his suffering? Before we go further, I want to say this clearly. This case involves the death of a child. The point of telling it should not be shock. It should be understanding. How abuse like this can hide, how evidence eventually exposed it, and what warning signs people missed along the way. And as we go through this, I want you to keep one question in mind. At what point would you have become suspicious?
Before Lacey Spears became known for a murder case, she was known by people around her as Garnet's mother. That sounds simple, but in this story, it matters. Because for years, motherhood was not just part of Lacey's life. It was the center of the identity she presented to everyone. Lacey was originally from Alabama. Garnet was born on December 3, 2008, in Decatur, Alabama. From early in his life, Lacey described him as medically fragile. She told people about health problems. She moved between doctors and hospitals. She posted updates online. She wrote about the search for answers. And in the world of social media, that kind of story can create a community very quickly. A sick child, a worried mother, hospital updates, prayers in the comments, photos that make strangers feel connected. There is nothing automatically suspicious about that. Many parents of sick children share updates because they are scared and isolated. Sometimes online support is the only emotional support they have. But in the Lacey Spears case, investigators would later look back at those posts differently, because the online story presented Garnet as a child constantly battling illness.
The medical evidence, however, did not always match the story Lacey was telling. And that is our first clue. In any investigation, the first question is, who controls the narrative? With Garnet, Lacey controlled almost everything. She told doctors what symptoms he had. She told friends when he was in danger. She told social media when to worry. She told people about his father. She told the story of Garnet's life. And when one person controls the story, everyone else is forced to investigate through that person's version of events. That does not make someone guilty, but it does mean the story has to be checked against evidence. And in Garnet's case, that evidence would begin to quietly contradict the image.
According to reporting and later court records, Garnet had many medical encounters as a young child. Some reports describe Lacey taking him to numerous doctors and hospitals. She reported serious symptoms and illnesses, but the appellate court later noted that some of those reported illnesses were never confirmed and in some cases had already been ruled out by other physicians. This is where the case becomes complicated, because if a child is genuinely sick, it is normal for a parent to search for answers. It is normal to go from doctor to doctor. It is normal to feel like nobody is listening. So from the outside, Lacey's behavior could look like persistence. It could look like advocacy. It could look like a mother refusing to give up. But investigators would later see another possibility. What if the constant medical crisis was not happening despite Lacey? What if it was happening because of her? That is the terrifying possibility at the center of factitious disorder imposed on another, often known by its older name, Munchausen syndrome by proxy. In these cases, a caregiver exaggerates, fabricates, or causes illness in someone under their care, often a child. The caregiver may receive attention, sympathy, status, or emotional validation from the crisis, and the victim may be subjected to tests, procedures, hospitalizations, and even direct harm. Now, it is important to be careful here. We are not saying every parent who pushes doctors for answers is suspicious. Parents often have to fight hard to get children diagnosed. The red flag is not advocacy. The red flag is when the medical facts keep contradicting the caregiver's story, when symptoms appear under strange circumstances, when the child gets worse around one person, when the caregiver resists the child becoming medically independent. And that brings us to one of the most important objects in this case, the feeding tube. When Garnet was an infant, he had surgery that included placement of a gastrointestinal tube, or G-tube. A G-tube allows nutrition or medicine to be administered directly into the stomach. For many families, a feeding tube is life-saving. It is not inherently suspicious. It can be essential medical care. But in Garnet's case, the tube becomes one of the central clues. The appellate court decision later noted that when Garnet started nursery school, Lacey took him to a gastroenterologist who questioned whether the child still needed the G-tube. But it was never removed. Lacey reported that she still used it for liquid nutrition overnight. Yet 3 of Lacey's friends and Garnet's teacher testified that Garnet had a good appetite and ate normally when he was in their care. Pause on that, because that is not a dramatic clue. It is not a confession. It is not a single smoking gun. It is the kind of clue that looks small until you place it next to everything else. If Garnet could eat normally, why was the tube still there? If doctors questioned whether he needed it, why was it kept? And if someone wanted to introduce something into his body without him tasting it, refusing it, or understanding it, what would a feeding tube make possible? This is the point where the detective story becomes deeply uncomfortable. Because the same device that could help a vulnerable child could also be turned into a weapon. At trial and on appeal, prosecutors argued that Lacey used Garnet's feeding tube to administer salt. Salt is everywhere. It is ordinary. It sits on kitchen tables.
It seems harmless because most of us use it every day. But in high concentrations, sodium can become deadly. It can pull water out of cells. It can disrupt the brain. It can cause seizures, coma, brain swelling, and death. And Garnett had experienced unexplained high sodium before. According to the appellate court, prosecutors presented testimony from a physician who treated Garnett for unexplained hypernatremia when he was 2.5 months old. That earlier incident mattered because it suggested Lacy knew what high sodium could do to him. So by the time we reach January 2014, we are not looking at a story that begins out of nowhere. We are looking at a medical history with patterns, reported illnesses, a feeding tube that remained in place, unconfirmed conditions, and a previous high sodium episode. Then comes the final hospital admission.
On January 17, 2014, Garnett's teacher stopped by Lacy's apartment. According to the appellate court, the teacher noticed a feeding bag attached to a pole in the middle of the room. Garnett was on the couch and seemed uncomfortable. This is the first scene in the final sequence. No police yet, no murder charge. Just a teacher stopping by, a child on the couch, and a feeding bag in the room. Shortly after the teacher left, Lacy called a friend and reported that Garnett was having a seizure. The friend came over and saw Garnett hooked up to a feeding bag. Then Lacy and the friend brought him to Nyack Hospital. At the hospital, Lacy reported that Garnett had experienced 3 episodes she believed were seizures. That was the working theory: seizures. So doctors responded to the information they had. They admitted Garnett and ordered a video EEG. An EEG measures electrical activity in the brain. The video allows doctors to compare what they see physically with what is happening neurologically. If a child is having seizures, the EEG can help prove it. If the child is not having seizures, the EEG can help rule it out. In other words, the camera was put there to catch the illness. But in a case like this, cameras do something else. They remove some of the caregiver's control over the story. They record what actually happens. And on January 19th, that camera captured a pattern the doctors could not ignore.
The footage from January 19th showed Lacy and Garnett entering the bathroom area of the hospital room. According to the court record, Lacy walked toward the bathroom carrying a white cup and what appeared to be an attachment that connected to Garnett's G-tube. Garnett exited the bathroom and became ill soon after. He dry heaved. He complained of a severe headache. He had diarrhea. After he recovered, the footage showed Lacy and Garnett entering the bathroom again. Again, Lacy appeared to be carrying a white cup and the G-tube attachment. Again, Garnett developed similar symptoms. And then he began to show what hospital staff initially thought might be signs of a seizure. But the EEG did not show seizure activity. Instead, it showed significant slowing of brain waves, suggesting severe brain dysfunction. This is the kind of moment where a case pivots. Before the footage, Lacy's report frames the medical response. After the footage, the objective evidence begins to challenge the report. Because the sequence is no longer vague. It is no longer just Garnett got sick. It is, he goes into the bathroom with Lacy. She appears to have items connected to his feeding tube. He comes out. He becomes sick. It happens more than once, and the EEG does not confirm seizures. If you are a doctor, that is alarming. If you are an investigator, that is a pattern. And if you are telling this as a documentary, this is where the audience should feel the story snap into focus. Because the hospital was looking for a hidden illness, but the camera may have captured hidden behavior.
After the hospital footage and the symptoms, doctors ordered blood testing. The result showed abnormally high sodium and chloroden. The medical term is hypernatremia, too much sodium in the blood. Hypernatremia is dangerous because sodium helps regulate the body's fluid balance. When sodium becomes extremely high, water shifts out of brain cells. The brain can shrink, blood vessels can tear, and the body can enter a life-threatening crisis. In Garnett's case, the situation became catastrophic. He could no longer breathe on his own. He was airlifted to another hospital, where doctors diagnosed hypernatremia of unknown origin. About 2 days later, Garnett suffered cerebral edema and herniation of the brainstem. He was declared brain dead. On January 23, 2014, Garnett Spears died. He was 5 years old. And after his death, doctors had to answer a question that would become the center of the criminal case. How did so much sodium get into his body? This is where the case begins moving from medicine to law enforcement. One treating physician contacted Child Protective Services because after consulting with specialists, he believed salt had been introduced into Garnett's G-tube. The medical examiner reached a similar conclusion. The prosecution would later present expert testimony supporting that conclusion. And the court record makes one thing clear. The doctors were not just dealing with an unexplained tragedy. They believed an outside source of sodium had been introduced into Garnett's body. That phrase matters, outside source, because if the sodium did not come from a natural process, then someone had to put it there.
Investigators then began looking for evidence outside the hospital.
And in Lacy's apartment, they found 2 open containers of salt. On its own, that would mean very little. Most homes have salt. But investigators also tested 2 feeding bags taken from the apartment. Those feeding bags revealed high levels of sodium. Now, the feeding tube is no longer just a theory. It is connected to the physical evidence. The prosecution's argument became clearer. Garnett was being given salt through his feeding system, and not just once. The state argued that this was part of a longer pattern of abuse. The appellate court later described the evidence as showing a brutal, prolonged, and ultimately fatal course of conduct against a vulnerable child. That phrase is important because Lacy was convicted of depraved indifference murder of a child. This was not framed as a sudden act. It was framed as a pattern. Repeated medical manipulation, repeated sickening, repeated failure to tell doctors what was actually happening. And when doctors were fighting to save Garnett, the person who could have explained the source of the sodium did not do so. That is one of the hardest parts of this case to sit with, because once Garnett was in medical crisis, his doctors were trying to solve a puzzle under extreme time pressure. If they had known he had been given salt through the G-tube, treatment decisions could have changed. But according to the prosecution's theory, Lacy was not just creating the crisis, she was also hiding the answer.
Then investigators found another clue.
3 days before Garnett's final hospital admission, searches had been performed on Lacy's phone. According to the appellate court, those searches included terms related to normal sodium levels for a child and the dangers of high sodium levels in a child. In a case like this, phone searches become powerful because they can show awareness. They can show what someone was thinking about before the event. They can show knowledge of a risk before the harm occurs. Of course, a search is not a confession. A parent might search medical symptoms for many reasons, but again, this is not a case built on one clue. It is the chain. A child with a feeding tube, a history of reported illnesses, a previous unexplained sodium episode, an admission for seizure-like symptoms, hospital footage involving the bathroom, a cup, and tube-related equipment, symptoms after those bathroom trips, EEG results inconsistent with seizures,
dangerously high sodium and chloride, salt containers in the apartment, high sodium in feeding bags, phone searches about sodium dangers. Each piece reinforces the next. That is how investigators solved the case. Not with one dramatic revelation, but by assembling a pattern so strong that the medical mystery became a murder case. Now we have to talk about the online side of the case. Because Laci was not only accused of poisoning Garnett, she was also known for documenting his illness. She posted about his health. She asked for support. She presented his struggle to an online audience. And this is where the case becomes especially modern. Before social media, a person seeking sympathy might rely on family, neighbors, doctors, or a local community. But online, the audience can be much larger. Every post can bring comments. Every medical update can bring concern. Every hospital photo can bring attention. And attention can become reinforcing. Again, we have to be careful. Sharing pain online does not mean someone is exploiting it. But in this case, prosecutors argued that attention was part of the motive. The appellate court later referenced evidence suggesting Laci was fixated on gaining attention and sympathy for herself. And from a documentary perspective, this is the emotional core of the story. Because the same public that believed it was supporting a mother may have been witnessing a performance. The same posts that looked like proof of devotion may have helped build the image that protected her. And the same digital trail that drew people into Garnett's story may have later helped investigators understand Laci's behavior. My own view is that this is what makes the case feel so disturbing. It is not only that a child was harmed, it is that compassion itself was used as cover. Friends trusted Laci because she seemed worried. Doctors listened because parents are supposed to know their children. Online followers responded because that is what decent people do when they see a sick child. The emotional reflex was kindness, and that kindness became part of the environment where the abuse could continue. That is not the fault of the people who cared, but it is one of the lessons of the case. Concern should never replace evidence, and a caregiver's emotional display should never make a child's medical facts invisible.
Another piece of the case involves Garnett's father. Laci told a story about Garnett's paternity that included a fictional police officer named Blake, who had supposedly died in a car accident. The real biological father was Chris Hill. According to reporting summarized in multiple sources, Laci told Chris Hill that Garnett was not his son and warned him to stay away. This matters because it fits a broader pattern. Laci controlled access. She controlled the medical story. She controlled the public story. She controlled the father story. And by controlling those stories, she limited the number of people who could challenge her version of Garnett's life. In many abuse cases, isolation is not always physical. Sometimes it is narrative isolation. The victim exists inside a story built by the abuser. Other people may be present, but they are only allowed to see the version they are given. Garnett had teachers, friends, doctors, online followers. But Laci remained the central narrator. And as long as the narrator was trusted, the story held. Until the medical evidence broke it. After Garnett died, the investigation continued for months. In June 2014, Laci Spears surrendered to authorities. She pleaded not guilty. She was charged with second-degree depraved murder and first-degree manslaughter. The phrase depraved indifference can sound abstract, so let's break it down. In New York law, depraved indifference murder is not simply carelessness. It involves conduct showing an utter disregard for human life. In the appellate decision, the court explained that a person can be convicted under this theory in rare circumstances,
including a brutal, prolonged, and ultimately fatal course of conduct against a particularly vulnerable victim. The prosecution argued that Garnett was exactly that kind of victim. A 5-year-old child, dependent on his mother, dependent on adults to interpret his symptoms, dependent on the person who had access to his feeding tube. At trial, the state did not have to prove that Laci stood up and confessed. They had to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that she caused his death under circumstances showing depraved indifference to human life. And their case was built like a timeline. The long medical history, the feeding tube, the final admission, the hospital video, the sodium spike, the feeding bags, the phone searches, the expert testimony. This was not a case where investigators found one clue and stopped. They built a structure, and then they asked the jury to decide whether any innocent explanation could still stand inside it.
Laci Spears went on trial in 2015. The prosecution argued that she had poisoned Garnett with salt through his feeding tube. They said she used his illness to gain attention and sympathy. They presented testimony about his medical history, the hospital footage, the sodium levels, and the evidence found in the apartment. The defense argued that the evidence did not prove murder. They questioned whether Laci could have administered salt in the hospital bathroom in the way prosecutors described. They also pointed toward medical uncertainty and argued that the hospital, not Laci, bore responsibility for what happened. This is important for a fair documentary. The defense did not simply say, "Ignore the evidence." They challenged the interpretation of the evidence. Because in court, the issue is not whether a story feels emotionally obvious. The issue is whether the state proves its case beyond a reasonable doubt. And after deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. On March 2, 2015, Laci Spears was found guilty of second-degree murder. Reports from the courtroom noted that she showed little visible emotion. For some viewers, that detail may feel significant, but I would be careful with it. People react strangely in courtrooms. Shock, fear, dissociation, personality, legal advice. All of it can affect expression. The real evidence was not her face when the verdict was read. The real evidence was the medical and forensic trail that brought the jury there. On April 8, 2015, Laci Spears was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Prosecutors had sought the maximum sentence of 25 years to life. The judge described the crime as unfathomable in its cruelty and said it brought Garnett years of torment and pain. But the judge did not impose the maximum. He referenced Munchausen syndrome by proxy, indicating that this played a role in his sentencing decision. This is one of the places where people still debate the case. Was 20 years to life enough? Should the maximum have been imposed? Should mental illness affect sentencing when the victim is a child? My view is that mental health can explain behavior without excusing it. If someone has a disorder that drives them toward harm, that matters for understanding risk, prevention, and treatment. But the child still suffered. The child still died. And the legal system still has to respond to the act, not just the psychology behind it. That tension is why this case is so difficult. Because if Laci's behavior was connected to a psychological disorder, then the story is more complex than simple evil. But complexity does not bring Garnett back, and complexity does not erase accountability.
Laci appealed her conviction. In 2017, the New York Appellate Division affirmed the judgment. The court reviewed the evidence and found it legally sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It also found that the verdict was not against the weight of the evidence. The appellate court specifically noted that the evidence demonstrated Laci introduced salt into Garnett's G-tube more than once, despite awareness of its effect on his condition, and that she did not tell doctors the cause of his symptoms as they struggled to treat him.
The court also addressed an evidentiary issue involving a Wikipedia article about hypernatremia. It found that admitting that article had been an error because it was not properly authenticated for the relevant date, but the court ruled the error was harmless because the evidence of guilt was overwhelming. That detail is useful for the documentary because it shows the appeal was not ignored. The court did find a mistake, but it did not change the outcome. The conviction stood. The sentence stood. And according to available reporting, Lacey Spears remains incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women, with parole eligibility no earlier than June 12, 2034. By then, Garnett would have been 25 years old. That is a number worth sitting with, because true crime can turn people into cases. Garnett was not a case. He was a child. He had a name, a birthday, teachers, friends, a father, and a future that never happened.
So now we return to the question from the beginning. When should someone have noticed? The honest answer is difficult. It is easy, after a conviction, to look backward and say the signs were obvious. But in real time, they were scattered across different people and different places. One doctor sees one episode, another doctor hears a different history. A teacher sees a child who eats normally. A friend sees a worried mother. An online follower sees a prayer request. Each person has only a fragment. Lacey had the whole story. That is one reason medical child abuse can be so hard to detect. The warning signs often do not sit in one file. They are distributed. They live in contradictions. The child eats normally with other people, but the parent says he needs tube feeding. The parent reports illnesses that doctors cannot confirm. The child worsens around the caregiver. The caregiver moves between doctors. Medical histories do not line up. The caregiver seems unusually invested in the sick role. In Garnett's case, there were warning signs, but they did not become undeniable until the final hospitalization, when objective evidence caught up with the pattern. And that may be the most important lesson. Systems need ways to connect fragments sooner. Teachers, doctors, nurses, social workers, and relatives may each see one odd detail. But if no one connects those details, the pattern stays hidden. The Lacey Spears case still matters because it sits at the intersection of several modern fears. The fear that someone can perform goodness while doing harm. The fear that social media can reward suffering. The fear that medical systems can be manipulated. The fear that a child can be visible to everyone and still unseen. And that last part is what stays with me. Garnett was not hidden away from the world. He was posted about, talked about, taken to doctors, seen by teachers, surrounded by people who thought they were witnessing illness. But visibility is not the same as protection. Sometimes being seen through the wrong story can be its own kind of invisibility. Everyone saw the sick boy. Too few people saw the endangered boy. And that difference cost him everything. My personal view of this case is that it should make us more precise, not more paranoid. It should not make us suspicious of every parent posting about a sick child. Most parents in that position are exhausted, terrified, and doing their best. It should not make us dismiss mothers who fight for medical answers. Many children are alive because a parent refused to stop asking questions. But it should make us pay attention to contradictions, not vibes, not facial expressions, not whether someone cries enough or too much. Contradictions. Does the medical evidence match the story? Do symptoms happen mostly around one caregiver? Does the child improve when separated? Are doctors being given complete information? Is the caregiver seeking recovery or seeking crisis? Those are the questions that matter, because in this case, emotion was misleading. The facts were the way out. And that is why the detective approach is so important. Compassion says, this mother is suffering. Evidence asks, why is the child suffering? Both questions can exist, but the second one has to come first when a child's life is at stake.
Lacey Spears built a public image around being Garnett's protector. But in 2015, a jury found that she was the person who killed him. The case was not solved by one dramatic confession. It was solved by a chain of evidence. A feeding tube that remained central to Garnett's life. Symptoms that did not match the reported seizure story. Hospital footage showing a repeated bathroom pattern. Blood tests revealing dangerous sodium. Feeding bags with high sodium levels. Phone searches about sodium danger. Medical experts who concluded salt had been introduced from outside the body. And a court that found the evidence strong enough to uphold the conviction. At the beginning, people asked, what is wrong with Garnett? By the end, the answer was, Garnett was not the mystery. The mystery was the person telling everyone his story. And once investigators stopped accepting that story at face value, the truth began to emerge. So now I want to ask you, what do you think was the biggest missed warning sign? Was it the repeated hospital visits? The feeding tube? The online attention? The inconsistent medical claims? Or the moment the EEG failed to show seizures? And one more question. Do you think social media made Lacey harder to question because it made her look like a devoted mother? Or did it help expose the pattern by leaving a digital trail behind? Leave your thoughts below. And if you want more cases told step by step with the evidence followed like a trail, subscribe for the next documentary.